Elijah Thorne knew it before the doctor said it, before his grandmother's cough turned wet and ragged, before her hands became too weak to hold the nautilus shell she'd kept on her windowsill for 60 years. He knew it the way you know winter is coming, not from any single sign, but from 1,000 small ones that add up to a truth you don't want to face. "Build me something beautiful," she whispered one October morning, her fingers tracing the spiral pattern of the shell. "Before I go, build me something that proves you were listening all those years." She'd been teaching him since he could walk, not letters, not numbers. Those came from the schoolhouse in town. She taught him shapes, the geometry of nature, the way a spider's web distributes tension, the way a honeycomb stores the most honey with the least wax, the way a nautilus shell curves inward in a perfect mathematical spiral that's been unchanged for 500 million years. "Why does nature build in spirals?" she would ask him. "Because spirals are strong," young Elijah would answer. "Stronger than what?" "Stronger than straight lines, stronger than corners, stronger than anything man builds." She would smile and hand him the shell, letting him trace its curves with his small fingers. "Remember that. When everyone tells you to build square, remember the shell." Now she was dying, and Elijah was 17, and he had perhaps 2 months to build something that would prove he'd remembered. Blue Ridge Mountains, North Carolina, October 1894. The settlement had grown accustomed to Elijah's strangeness, the boy who preferred books to hunting, the boy who drew shapes in the dirt instead of playing games, the boy who asked questions that made grown men uncomfortable. Questions about why they built houses the way they did, why everyone's cabin looked the same, why nobody tried anything different. "Because it works," his father had told him back when his father was alive. Square walls, peaked roof, stone chimney. It works, and when something works, you don't fix it. His father had died in a cabin with square walls and a peaked roof and a stone chimney. Typhoid fever, winter of 1891. The cabin had worked just fine. It hadn't saved him. His mother followed 6 months later. Grief, the doctor said, though Elijah suspected it was simply the will to live leaking out of a woman who'd lost everything that mattered. The cabin with its square walls watched her die too. Only grandmother remained. And now she was leaving, and Elijah was determined to give her something before she went. "The boy's lost his mind," Samuel Crawford announced at the trading post on October 15th. Crawford had been building cabins in the Blue Ridge for 40 years, and he'd seen plenty of young men try strange things. Most learned. Some died. None had ever attempted what Elijah Thorne was attempting now. "He's drawing a snail in the snow," Crawford continued, shaking his head. "Got his grandmother's shell sitting next to him, and he's drawing the same shape in the ground with stakes and rope. Says he's going to build a house that looks like it." The men laughed. Of course they laughed. "A snail house," Jacob Hendricks repeated, savoring the absurdity. "What's next? A fish barn? A butterfly church? Boys grieving?" Father Williams said, more gently than the others. "His grandmother's fading. People do strange things when they're losing someone." "Strange is one thing," Crawford replied. "Stupid is another. That spiral shape he's drawing. There's no way to build walls like that. Wood doesn't bend that way. And even if it did, what's the point? A round house is hard enough. A spiral house is impossible." But Elijah wasn't listening to them. He was kneeling in the snow, rope in hand, creating the blueprint for something that existed only in his grandmother's stories and the ancient shell on her windowsill. The spiral took him 3 days to mark correctly. The mathematics were complex, not simple circles, but a logarithmic curve that expanded at a constant rate as it wound outward from the center. His grandmother had taught him the formula years ago, traced from a textbook she'd saved from her own schooling decades before anyone in the settlement was born. The golden ratio, she'd called it. Nature's favorite number. You'll find it in sunflowers and hurricanes in the arms of galaxies, and in this shell. Elijah used the shell as his template, scaling up its proportions with rope and stakes until the spiral pattern covered a space 40 feet across. The stakes looked like strange teeth erupting from the snow, marking a shape that no one in the settlement had ever seen used for construction. Thomas Reed was the first neighbor to approach with genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "What is it?" Reed asked, walking the spiral's perimeter. "I mean, I can see it's a spiral, but what's it for?" "Wind," Elijah said simply. "Wind?" "My grandmother says hurricanes are spirals, biggest storms on Earth, and they're all built the same way, spinning inward, gathering strength. She says if you want to survive a spiral, you have to think like one." Reed frowned. "We don't get hurricanes here. Mountains are too high. We didn't get tornadoes either. Until we did." Elijah drove another stake into the frozen ground. "My grandmother says the weather is changing. Says she can feel it in her bones. Storms coming that these mountains have never seen. Your grandmother's dying, Elijah. No disrespect, but dying people say things. Dying people tell the truth. They don't have time for anything else." Reed had no answer for that. He watched Elijah work for another hour, then walked home to his square cabin with its peaked roof and its corners that had always been good enough before. The frame was the hardest part. Spiral walls required curved wood, not just bent, but continuously curved, each piece following the logarithmic spiral that his grandmother had taught him. Straight logs wouldn't work. Even steam-bent logs couldn't hold such complex curves without splitting. Elijah solved the problem with ribs. Instead of solid walls, he built a skeleton, dozens of curved wooden ribs that rose from the ground and arched inward, following the spiral pattern like the bones of some enormous prehistoric creature. Each rib was made from multiple pieces of steam-bent wood, joined together to form continuous curves that no single piece could achieve. The steam box took him a week to build. A long wooden chamber with a fire underneath, designed to heat water into steam that would soften the wood fibers and make them flexible. He'd work from dawn until dark, feeding logs into the box, waiting for them to soften, then bending them around forms he'd carved to match different sections of the spiral. His grandmother watched from her window when she had strength. Some days she could sit up. Other days she couldn't lift her head from the pillow. But her eyes tracked his progress, and sometimes Elijah would see her lips moving. Prayers, perhaps, or instructions she no longer had breath to shout. "The boy's building a whale skeleton," Crawford observed one afternoon, watching from a distance. The curved ribs did look like bones, arching against the gray November sky like the remains of some massive creature. Must be 50 of those curved pieces now. How long did that take? 3 weeks, Hendricks estimated. 3 weeks of bending and shaping and fitting for something that'll probably collapse under its own weight. If the wind doesn't take it first, those curves will catch every breeze like sails. But they were wrong about the wind. The curved ribs didn't catch breezes. They deflected them. Even incomplete, the spiral frame demonstrated an principle that Crawford's 40 years of experience had never taught him. Curved surfaces don't resist wind. They redirect it. The same breeze that rattled the square walls of Crawford's cabin slid smoothly around Elijah's spiral frame without finding anything to push against. Not that Crawford noticed. He wasn't paying attention to how wind moved. He was waiting for failure, and failure was the only thing he knew how to see. November 15th, 1 month into construction. Elijah's grandmother called him to her bedside in the middle of the night. The summons came through his aunt, who'd been sleeping in the next room and had heard the old woman's voice. Stronger than it had been in weeks, almost urgent. "Bring the shell," grandmother said when Elijah appeared. "And sit." He sat. The Nautilus shell felt warm in his hands, though that might have been imagination. "You're building it wrong." Elijah's heart stopped. "What?" "The entrance. You've got it facing east. It needs to face west." "But the morning sun. Forget the sun." Her hand found his in the darkness, grip surprisingly strong. "The bad storms come from the southwest. They hook around from the Atlantic, gather strength over the warm water, then swing north. When they hit these mountains, they'll come from the southwest every time." "How do you know?" "Because I've lived through 4 hurricanes, child, before I came to these mountains, before I met your grandfather. I grew up on the Carolina coast, and I watched storms flatten everything men built while the shells on the beach survived untouched." She coughed, a wet sound that made Elijah wince. "The spiral needs to face the storm, the wide part of the shell toward the wind. Let it flow around you instead of hitting you head on." Elijah looked at the shell in his hands, understanding for the first time why she'd kept it all these years. It wasn't decoration. It was a diagram, a blueprint, a survival manual encoded in calcium carbonate by 500 million years of evolution. "Change the entrance," grandmother said. "Tomorrow. Promise me." "I promise." She smiled and closed her eyes. "Good boy. You always listened, even when you pretended not to." He changed the entrance the next morning, tore out 2 days of work, and rebuilt it facing west, toward the storms she said would come. The neighbors thought he'd made a mistake and was fixing it. They laughed at that too. Let them laugh, Elijah thought. They're not building for a dying woman's last wish. They're not racing against time. The shingles went on in December. Curved shingles, each one cut to fit the spiral's constantly changing radius. Elijah developed a system: measure, cut, test, adjust, attach. Each shingle overlapped the one below, creating a surface that would shed rain the way the Nautilus shell shed water, channeling it around and down in smooth streams rather than letting it pool or penetrate. The work was slow, painfully slow. Each day brought him closer to completion, but each day also brought his grandmother closer to death. Some mornings, he would check on her before starting work and find her so still that his heart would seize, only to see her chest rise with shallow breath, proving she was still fighting. "How is she?" the women of the settlement would ask when they brought food. "Still here," Elijah would answer. "Still waiting." "Waiting for what?" "To see it finished." They would nod and look at the strange spiral structure taking shape in the clearing, and most of them would think he was foolish. But a few, the older ones, the ones who'd lost people themselves, would understand. Sometimes you build things for reasons that have nothing to do with practicality. December 20th, 2 days before Christmas, the spiral cabin was complete. Elijah stood before it in the winter dusk, exhausted beyond words, hands raw and bleeding from 2 months of continuous labor. The structure rose before him like something from a dream. Curved walls spiraling inward, wooden shingles following the shape like scales on a snake, a chimney rising from the center where the spiral tightened to its core. It looked like nothing else in the Blue Ridge. Nothing else anywhere, probably. a nautilus shell rendered in wood and determination and love. Bring her. Elijah's aunt appeared in the doorway of the old cabin. What? Bring grandmother. Wrap her in blankets. Carry her if you have to. She needs to see it while there's still light. They carried her on a chair, 4 of them, Elijah, his aunt, Thomas Reed, who'd come to help, and Father Williams, who happened to be passing. Grandmother weighed almost nothing now, bones and skin and fading breath, but she insisted on keeping her eyes open despite the cold. They set her down 20 feet from the spiral cabin, and Elijah watched her face. For a long moment, she said nothing, just looked. Her eyes traced the curves from entrance to center, following the mathematical pattern she'd taught him from her shell. Her lips moved silently, counting, perhaps, or praying, or simply naming something she'd never thought she'd live to see. Then she smiled. "You were listening," she whispered. "Always," Elijah said. "It's beautiful. It's yours." She shook her head weakly. "No, it's yours. My gift was the knowledge, the shell, the stories. You made this." Her hand found his, cold and thin as paper. "You made something new, Elijah. Something that didn't exist before. That's the only real gift anyone can give. Making something new." She died 3 days later. Christmas morning, as the settlement gathered for prayers, she simply stopped breathing. The doctor said she'd been holding on for something, and once she saw it, she could finally let go. Elijah buried her beside his parents, behind the square cabin where she'd spent her final years. But the shell went with him to the spiral cabin, set on a windowsill where the morning light could touch it, where its curves could echo the curves of the walls surrounding it. The hurricane came in March. No one expected it. March was too early, too cold, too far from the season when such storms normally formed. But the weather in 1895 wasn't normal. Something had shifted in the atmosphere, patterns changing in ways that the old farmers' almanacs hadn't predicted and couldn't explain. The storm gathered strength over the Gulf of Mexico, fed by waters that were warmer than they should have been in early spring. It curved north along the Atlantic coast, growing larger with each passing hour, then hooked inland across Georgia with sustained winds that would later be estimated at over 120 miles per hour. By the time it reached the Blue Ridge Mountains, it had weakened. But weakened for a hurricane still meant winds that could tear roofs from cabins and flatten barns like paper boxes. The mountains channeled and compressed the storm, creating gusts that exceeded anything the region had experienced in recorded memory. March 14th, 1895. The day the wind came to Blue Ridge. Elijah heard it before he saw it. A roar that started low and built until it sounded like a locomotive bearing down on the settlement. The sky had turned the color of a bruise, greenish yellow with black streaks, and the trees were bending at angles that made his stomach clench. He ran for the spiral cabin. Not because he was sure it would hold, but because it was his, because his grandmother had blessed it, because dying anywhere else seemed wrong. Behind him, the world came apart. Crawford's cabin, 40 years of experience, square walls, peaked roof, lost its roof in a single gust. The wind got under the eaves and lifted, and 800 pounds of timber and shingle simply flew away, spinning into the chaos like a leaf in a stream. Hendrix's barn exploded outward, walls bursting as the pressure differential between inside and outside exceeded what the flat surfaces could withstand. The square shape caught the wind like a sail, and the sail tore itself to pieces. The church, the trading post, the mill house. Elijah saw them through the rain as he ran, saw walls buckling, roofs lifting, corners crumbling. Everything with an edge was failing. Everything with a flat surface was becoming a weapon. He reached the spiral cabin and dove through the west-facing entrance just as the full force of the hurricane arrived. The sound inside was different. In a square building, hurricane winds create a cacophony: groaning wood, rattling windows, the percussion of debris striking flat walls. Every surface becomes a drum. Every corner becomes a stress point where forces concentrate until something breaks. The spiral cabin hummed. Elijah pressed himself against the curved interior wall and listened to the wind flow around him, not hitting the walls, flowing. Sliding along the curved surface the way water slides along a shell, unable to find purchase, unable to concentrate force, unable to do anything except continue moving. The entrance faced west, toward the storm, just as grandmother had instructed. The wide outer curve of the spiral presented itself to the wind like the bow of a ship, splitting the flow around both sides. The tightening inner spiral created a low-pressure zone at the center, actually stabilizing the structure instead of threatening it. Physics. Mathematics. 500 million years of evolution encoded in a shell and translated into wood by a grieving boy who'd been paying attention. The hurricane raged for 6 hours. Elijah sat in the center of his spiral, near the fireplace that he didn't dare light for fear of sparks. He could feel the structure flexing, not breaking, just moving, absorbing gusts and releasing them like a living thing breathing. Occasionally debris would strike the outer walls, and he would hear the impact, but the curved surface deflected everything away. Nothing could stick, nothing could penetrate, nothing could find the weakness that every square building possessed in its corners and flat faces. Grandmother had been right. She'd been right about everything. When the wind finally died and Elijah opened his door, he stepped into a different world. The settlement was gone. Not damaged, gone. Where Crawford's cabin had stood, only the foundation remained. Where the trading post had served 3 generations of mountain families, nothing remained but scattered planks and broken glass. The church had lost its steeple, its walls, its roof. Only the altar remained standing, somehow untouched amid the devastation, as if God had reached down to protect that one piece while abandoning everything else. 12 structures had stood in the hurricane's path. 11 were destroyed. The 12th was a spiral cabin that looked exactly as it had before the storm. Curved walls gleaming wetly in the post-hurricane light, chimney standing straight at its center, wooden shingles unbroken from entrance to core. Crawford found Elijah standing outside the spiral cabin at sunset, staring at the destruction. The old builder had survived by sheltering in his root cellar while his cabin disintegrated above him. His clothes were torn, his face was bleeding, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man watching his life's work scattered across 3 counties. How? Crawford's voice was barely audible. How is it still standing? Elijah didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about his grandmother, about the shell on his windowsill, about all the years she'd spent teaching him to see the shapes that nature used and man ignored. The spiral, he finally said. Wind can't push what it can't hit squarely. It just flows around and keeps going. Crawford stared at the curved walls, reached out and touched them, as if confirming they were real. I laughed at you, he said. I stood at the trading post and called you crazy, called your grandmother's ideas nonsense, said you were building a snail house that would collapse in the first strong breeze. I know. I was wrong. Crawford's voice cracked. 40 years of building, and I was wrong about everything that mattered. The survivors gathered at the spiral cabin that night. 17 people who had lost everything, sheltering in a structure they'd mocked for months. The curved interior was surprisingly spacious, the spiral creating alcoves and nooks where families could cluster together. The central fireplace sent warmth radiating outward in every direction, the spiral shape distributing heat evenly in ways that square rooms couldn't match. Father Williams led a prayer for the dead, 3 souls lost in the storm, including old Martha Briggs, who'd been caught outside when the winds came. Her body was found half a mile from her cabin, carried by gusts that had treated her frail form like a leaf. After the prayer, the survivors sat in silence, listening to the wind die down, watching firelight play across curved walls that had saved their lives. Thomas Reed was the one who finally spoke. "Your grandmother," he said to Elijah. "She taught you this? She taught me to pay attention, to look at how nature builds things instead of assuming men know better." Elijah touched the wall beside him, feeling its curve. "She said the nautilus shell has been the same shape for 500 million years. 500 million years of hurricanes and earthquakes and everything else the world can throw at it, and the shape hasn't changed. That's not an accident. That's proof." "Proof of what?" "Proof that some shapes survive and others don't. Proof that nature figured out the answers before men started asking the questions." Elijah looked at the shell on his windowsill, glowing amber in the firelight. "We just have to be smart enough to copy the homework." Someone laughed, a survivor's laugh, shaky but real. Then another. The tension broke, and people began talking, sharing stories of the storm, marveling at the structure that had protected them. Crawford sat apart from the others, still processing his 40 years of certainty crumbling like his cabin. But he was watching Elijah, watching and thinking. The rebuilding began in April. Not everyone chose the spiral design. It required skills that most settlers hadn't developed, materials that weren't always available, time that struggling families couldn't always spare. But enough did. Enough looked at the wreckage of their square homes and decided that tradition wasn't worth dying for. Crawford was the first convert. The man who had laughed loudest became Elijah's first student, learning to steam wood and bend curves and calculate logarithmic spirals from a 17-year-old boy who'd learned it from his dying grandmother. The work was humbling. Every mistake reminded Crawford how little he actually knew about building things that lasted. "Why are you helping me?" Crawford asked one day, struggling to bend a rib that refused to cooperate. "I mocked you for months, said terrible things about you and your grandmother." Elijah helped him adjust the angle, guiding the wood into its proper curve. "My grandmother said people laugh at what they don't understand. She also said, understanding can change anyone if they're willing." "And if they're not willing?" "Then they keep building square cabins, and sooner or later the wind finds them." Elijah stepped back, examining the rib. "But you're here. You're learning. That makes you willing." Crawford nodded slowly. The rib was perfect, a smooth curve that would become part of something new, something that might stand for 100 years or more. By summer, 5 spiral structures dotted the settlement. By the following year, 15. Word spread through the mountains, carried by survivors who'd seen the impossible. A hurricane that destroyed everything except the cabin built like a shell. Engineers from Raleigh came in the fall of 1896 to study the spiral cabin's survival. They measured angles, calculated stress distributions, and filled notebooks with diagrams and equations. Their conclusion, published in a regional engineering journal, confirmed what Elijah had built by intuition. The logarithmic spiral reduced wind load by approximately 60% compared to rectangular structures. while the curved surfaces eliminated the pressure differentials that destroyed conventional buildings. The structure essentially becomes invisible to the wind, the lead engineer explained to Elijah. Not invisible in the literal sense, but aerodynamically transparent. The wind doesn't see it as an obstacle to overcome. It sees it as a path to follow. My grandmother called it thinking like the storm, Elijah replied. Same idea, different words. The engineer wrote that down too. The emotional aftermath of the hurricane proved harder to rebuild than the physical structures. Crawford, despite his conversion to spiral building, never fully recovered his confidence. He would second-guess every joint, every curve, every decision, haunted by the memory of his lifelong certainty, proving worthless in a single afternoon. "How did you know?" he asked Elijah one evening as they worked together on a spiral cabin for the widow Morrison. "How did you know to trust your grandmother's ideas instead of everything everyone else was telling you?" Elijah thought about the question for a long time before answering. "I didn't know," he finally admitted. "I believed. There's a difference. Knowing means you have proof before you act. Believing means you act before you have proof, because something inside tells you the proof will come." That sounds like faith. Maybe it is. Maybe faith and observation are the same thing, just pointed in different directions. Elijah fitted another shingle into place. My grandmother observed nature for 80 years. She had faith that nature's solutions would work for human problems. I had faith in her. Turns out faith stacks. Her faith plus my faith equals something strong enough to survive a hurricane. Crawford had no response to that, but he worked a little more confidently after that conversation, as if some of Elijah's stacked faith had transferred to him. The widow Morrison's spiral cabin was completed in October 1896, the first one built entirely by someone other than Elijah. Crawford led the construction, with Elijah supervising only occasionally. The old builder had finally internalized the techniques, the steam bending, the logarithmic calculations, the way curved walls needed to be thought about differently than straight ones. "It's not just different building," Crawford told the gathered crowd at the cabin's completion. "It's different thinking. You have to stop seeing corners as necessary and start seeing them as weaknesses. You have to stop fighting nature and start copying it." He gestured at the spiral walls rising behind him. "Took me 40 years to learn that. The Thorn Boy learned it before he could shave." Elijah, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt his grandmother's presence in that moment. Not ghostly or supernatural, but simply present, the way important people remain present in the things they taught and the lives they changed. "She's still teaching," he murmured to himself. "Through me, through Crawford, through everyone who builds a spiral because they heard what she knew." The thorn spiral became recognized throughout the region. Elijah taught anyone who wanted to learn, never charging for knowledge his grandmother had given freely. He married Thomas Reed's daughter in 1897. A quiet ceremony at the rebuilt church, followed by a celebration in the spiral cabin where 17 survivors had sheltered during the hurricane. Sarah Reed had been one of those survivors. She'd watched Elijah calm the children during the worst of the storm, telling them stories about nautilus shells and grandmother wisdom while the wind screamed outside. She'd watched him share his food with families who had nothing, give his blankets to elderly survivors who couldn't stop shivering, work 18-hour days during the rebuilding without ever complaining or taking credit. "I want to live in a spiral," she told him the night he proposed. "Not because of the wind, because of what it means." "What does it mean?" "It means someone was brave enough to be different. It means someone loved someone else enough to build something impossible. It means... She touched his face, her eyes bright with tears. It means hope can be a shape, and I want to raise children inside that shape. They built her a spiral cabin with a nursery at the center, where their children would sleep surrounded by curves that wind couldn't break and love had designed. 3 children eventually, 2 boys and a girl, all of whom learned to bend wood before they learned to read. All of whom grew up knowing that their father had built something beautiful for a dying woman, and that dying woman had saved their family's future. The shell remained on Elijah's windowsill until he died in 1951 at age 74. His last words, according to his daughter who was holding his hand, were, "Tell her I kept listening." No one asked who her was. Everyone knew. The shell remained on his windowsill until he died in 1951 at age 74. By then, he'd built over 40 spiral structures, trained hundreds of apprentices, and seen his grandmother's knowledge spread across 4 states. Architects from universities came to study his designs, writing papers about the mathematics of natural forms applied to human construction. They called it biomimicry eventually, building things by copying nature's solutions. Elijah would have called it paying attention. His grandmother would have called it common sense. But whatever you called it, the results were the same. The spirals survived, the squares fell, and a dying woman's last wish became a legacy that outlived everyone who'd laughed at it. Elijah's original spiral cabin still stands. The shingles have been replaced twice, the chimney rebuilt once, but the curved walls remain. The same curves that a 17-year-old boy bent from, steamed wood while his grandmother watched from her window, fighting to stay alive long enough to see something beautiful. Visitors sometimes ask why the building is shaped like a shell. The answer hangs on the wall inside, a nautilus shell, mounted in a simple frame with a small brass plaque beneath it. The plaque reads, "She taught me to listen. This is what I heard." The spiral continues.